Welcome to Mind Meets Body and Soul, a podcast that connects the dots between clinical mental health and spiritual holistic wellness. I'm Heather, a licensed clinical social worker and mental health guru.
And I'm Devin, a Reiki master, spiritual teacher, and lover of all things woo-woo. We're here to discuss various wellness topics, highlighting the connection between the mind, body, and soul.
We'll be offering nuggets of wisdom from each of our fields with the ultimate goal of bridging the gap between our two worlds. Whether you lean more into cognitive psychology
or flow with the woo-woo waters, we're here to help you prioritize yourself and unlock a fresh perspective to healing, growth, and expansion. We're so excited you're here. Let's jump in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are here, episode 8. We have a very special episode for you today. I'm Devin DiGilio, here with my lovely co-host.
Hi, everyone. Heather Raffanello here. I'm so excited for this episode. This is going to be a really fun episode, a really important episode where we're bringing in our very first guest, who is a colleague of mine. We're bringing in Elyssa Toomey. Elyssa is a certified eating disorder specialist, clinical supervisor, registered dietitian, nutritionist, advanced registered yoga teacher, and she's so knowledgeable and experienced on all things about our relationship with food, our relationship with our body. So we're so excited, Elyssa, to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Elyssa, this is perfect timing to have you in. One, we are honored to have you as our very first podcast guest. And also, two, perfect timing because last week we had our episode centered around relationships. Heather called them intentional relationships. I like to call them conscious relationships or conscious partnerships. And we spoke throughout the entire episode about our relationships with other people. And we also tie that into our relationship with ourselves. So when Heather mentioned bringing you on as our first podcast guest and explaining what you did, I was like, wow, this is great timing because just as important as our relationship with others is, it's equally as important, if not more, our relationship to ourselves, our body, and your component, really the relationship to food. So thank you for being here. And you have quite the title behind you. So please let us in on what it is that you do.
Certainly. So, yeah, first, like this idea of our relationship with our body, right? I will say to clients all the time, it's the longest relationship you'll ever have, right? So it's really important that it's a peaceful one. And for a lot of people, for many different reasons, that is a challenge. And part of my work is to help people to create that peaceful relationship with their body and a peaceful relationship with food. So I take an anti-diet, right, weight inclusive wellness approach to do that and incorporate the principles of intuitive eating as well as the social justice framework of health at every size. And all of that ultimately is like looking at how food shows up for us, right? One is nutrition, of course, but also as joy, as pleasure, as connection, even as comfort. And that we want that relationship with food to be positive and using that, as an entry point to getting in touch with our body. And it goes both ways, right? Because we need to be in touch with our body in order to know, when am I hungry? Am I full? Is this food satisfying? Right? All of those different things. So I really think of it as this like parallel process of creating that intentional, right? To use the word that you were talking about last week, that really thoughtful, intentional relationship with how we're eating, as well as how is that showing up for us in our body.
I got the chills when you said that the longest relationship we have is with our body. Because I say that to clients all the time when they're coming in. I say, listen, you're the expert on you. You have had this relationship with yourself for literally ever. And I'm here as the professional. So I never really thought about like the relationship, obviously, with ourselves, but I never really thought of that relationship with our body also.
And often when I'm working with someone, the first question is like, tell me your food and body story, right? And there's often this point where someone will recall that it shifted, right? That at some point their body was this thing that they were living in, they were experiencing life. And then, somewhere in that sort of 10 to 13-year-old, and, obviously it could happen earlier or later, depending on circumstances, there's this understanding of like, oh, wait a minute, like people are seeing me, right? And there's that objectification that happens, which disconnects us from our body in many ways. And, the research supports this, that if you ask young girls to sort of draw a picture of themselves, they'll be drawing a picture of themselves like in action, right? Whether that's on a soccer field or up on a stage or something like that. And then as they hit this place where they recognize that like people are viewing them, right, the way that they perceive themselves and the way that they draw themselves changes. And really sad to think that this is in some ways a very, sort of innate process, but also it is unfortunately very much informed by the culture that we live in, right? This very toxic, thin idealized diet culture.
Absolutely. And I was smiling as you were explaining all that you do, because what's interesting about this podcast is we bring in Heather's field, which is more the clinical, the research, the psychology, mental based, and my field, which is more of the ancient spiritual teachings, the holistic side of things. And I feel like when you are explaining what it is that you do, you're like this perfect hybrid of both of us. You bring in all of that, like being a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and then also understanding that we have this sacred relationship with our body, and that is constantly evolving, and that it exists longer than any relationship we have. I mean, it's no wonder that you are our first guest on this podcast, because you bring together both what kind of Heather touches on and what I touch on. So how did you get into the field that you're now in, and with the approach that you take to diet, to nutrition, and body image?
So this was a career change for me. I spent the beginning part of my career working in fundraising and development. I was a major gift officer, and I always worked sort of adjacent to the healthcare world, right? I worked for a number of nonprofits, one particular, an anti-sexual violence organization, and that is where I really started to appreciate like trauma and what happens, right, in our bodies when we experience a sexual violence. So that was really wonderful for a long time. And then honestly, I was the person who was raising the money and I wanted to be the person who was implementing the programs. So I took a look at my life and I said, my happiest place is in my kitchen and making food and sharing food with the people that I care about. It's how I show love. And I've thankfully had a pretty easeful relationship with food and my body for most of my life. I mean, certainly, like many people in our culture, I've had those moments of thinking about wanting to change my body in some ways. But at that point, I was a mom and I had gone through, two pregnancies and realized like, wow, the body is really miraculous in this ability to grow another human. And a lot of things shifted for me then. And then I discovered yoga, and things shifted again, where I really began to feel my body as this source of strength and this like internal empowerment and this internal wisdom that I could tap into. And when I could connect my thoughts, my values, and my behaviors, I felt like, wow, this is how I want to, keep moving forward, which led me back to, I'm not sure that staying in fundraising is exactly what I want to do. And so from there, with a lot of thought, I decided to go back to school for nutrition because I wanted all people to have that easy relationship with food. And I knew right away that I wanted to go into this field of eating disorders, disordered eating, helping people get off of the chronic dieting cycle.
So tell us, because I'm not sure how familiar our listeners are. Obviously, like you and I work in a very similar world. Tell us a little bit more about this, like anti-diet, HAES, like health at every size. Tell us about that specific focus that you might have.
Yeah, sure. And this is something that I even said to my husband the other day. Like, I feel like I have evolved the longer that I spend in this field
Mm-hmm.
to say, I think when I first learned about this anti-diet world, I was maybe even a little militant about it. This idea of like this way or the highway, right? Because it is so beautiful and powerful as this way to reject this diet culture that tells us we're only worthy if we look a certain way, right? And the longer I've spent in relationship with clients, I have shifted to sort of say, like, your autonomy and your sovereignty is the most important thing. And I am here to support you in whatever way is going to be best for you. And so when I say I'm an anti diet dietitian, I am not against an individual's body changing, good or bad, in their, what they believe is good or bad. What I'm against is this, industrial complex that tells us we should be pursuing weight loss and that there's a right way to have a body. And this framework that elevates thinner bodies and demonizes larger bodies. And so I think it's really important to make that distinction between when we're talking about, sort of a body acceptance, a body neutrality, a body liberation. There are lots of nuanced differences between those things. But ultimately, this is the idea that, like, our body is this sacred place that we get to live in. I had an old supervisor who used to call it our earth suit, and I loved that idea, right? And right, that we hopefully can work to be in a respectful relationship with it, right? This place where we nourish it adequately and appropriately, where we move it in a way that feels beautiful and hopefully celebratory, where we manage our stress, where we get adequate sleep, right? And that wheel of sort of health and well-being as it relates to our body is pretty expansive, right? I will joke with clients and be like, it's about flossing your teeth, right? It's like about all of the things that we do to take care of ourselves, but in the means of taking care of ourselves so that we feel connected, so that we feel well, not so that we look a certain way.
So beautifully explained. Thank you for that. I like to refer to my body as my home. I think that's such an important distinction that you just made. And coming back to this whole diet culture or having to look a certain way, we've come a long way. I remember growing up hopping on the train of some of those fad diets. There were some apps that I would have downloaded where I would track every single thing that I was eating. And it's very wild for me to think that I was somebody concerned about my weight because I'm a petite person. But we've all been conditioned throughout our life to focus on a number and to focus on a certain look as opposed to a certain feel. So what I'm getting from you on your anti-diet culture take is to step away from the number and from the look and to come back more to the feeling at home in your body, in your earth suit.
Yeah, and I think, it's important for us to also name, right? Like, I sit here with a tremendous amount of privilege, right? I live in a straight size body. I am white. I am heterosexual. I'm, cisgendered. I have all these privileges. So for me, it is easier, right, to move into that place of body acceptance. And so part of the work, especially from the health at every size perspective, in the fat acceptance perspective, is to say, like, how do we dismantle, right, this culture that tells us something so that the work is not entirely on the individual, right? I feel like these are things that, especially people with this privilege, it's really our responsibility to try to change the world at large. And in fact, right, we're recording the day after legislation was passed in New York City, one of the few places in the country that has outlawed discrimination based on size. And the fact that it's one of the few places in the country is so sad, but also let's also celebrate, like, that is now beginning to change even more, which is a really beautiful and wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's like Devin said, we've come a long way. And then I also sometimes am like, oh, but we have so far to go. Like it's 2023 and some of these things are still happening. So I always kind of find myself in this like, yay, we're making progress. And then also I'm like, oh gosh, it just feels like there's still so much to go. It's this, I'm like, I vacillate between both.
For sure. Right. And I'm sure, Heather, in your work, you've had the same experiences that I have with clients, and you're sitting right in the grief of what
Mm-hmm.
it's like to live in a larger body, because there are institutional pressures, right? I've
Mm-hmm.
had clients who have been perhaps invited to a concert and say, like, I don't know if I can fit in that venue, in the seats in that venue, right? And that is no amount of loving yourself or loving your
Right.
body can change that. It's just about like, how do we create enough inner reserve and resilience and recognize that our self-worth has nothing to do with those numbers, Devin, that
Mm-hmm.
you were talking about. And it's unfortunate that that is the situation that we find ourselves in, or that a lot of, my clients find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
It also does not help that we have social media, that we have the marketing that we do, where all you're seeing are the cute outfits, the petite sizes, and again, we have come a long way where I'm happy to see that there is more representation of all shapes and sizes. But that doesn't necessarily undo the damage that's already been done, this perfect image that's been created.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Like I'm a lot older than both of you, but I grew up and there was, 17 magazine and Cosmopolitan magazine. We did
Mm-hmm.
not have social media, right? And that was hard enough then. And when we've added in social media and the influencer world, and listen, I am not here to demonize social media. I think there's some wonderful aspects to it. And in fact, I will have sometimes clients come in and talk about like a detox, quote unquote, or a cleanse. And I'm like, well, we're not doing that, right? But what we can do is like detox your social media feed, right? We
Right.
can curate this feed to be in line with the things that are truly important to us, as opposed to seeing, those influencer sites of like, eat like me and move like me and you'll look like me, right? Because that's just not taking into account so many different things that create someone's body shape and size, right? From genetics to social determinants of health to so many different other things. So I think, all of us in this world who are trying to create this connection between our spirit, our mind, our body, right? We've got a lot of work cut out for us.
There's so much I feel like that we can talk about, and there's so many like rabbit holes that I'm like trying to stop myself from going down in this conversation for the sake of time. But I guess my question is, Elyssa, how do you apply these conversations? What does this work actually look like in your sessions with the clients that you're working with in the life that you're living?
Yeah. So thank you. I think one of the first things is going in through sort of the avenue of food, right? But in that connected way to our body. So many people who are struggling in their relationship with food are so disconnected from their bodies, right? They're kind of almost walking around as floating heads. And so, in that safe way, it's like, how do we invite people back into their body,
Mm-hmm.
which, depending on their experiences, is going to be done in a really trauma sensitive way. And it can be like, can you feel your feet on the floor, right? Sometimes we start that simply. Can you feel, right, your back connected and supported by the back of your chair? Is it feel safe to put two hands over your heart and just begin to feel the breath in your body? Eventually, can you put a hand on your heart and a hand on your belly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because for a lot of people, that can be very uncomfortable. And using those as the tools into the body. And I will ask people to talk about, like, what does hunger even feel like in their body? And for a lot of people, that's really hard to describe. Um, And I will sort of back up a little bit and be like, okay, well, let's think about how our body's communicating to us all day long, right? Those interoceptive awareness cues. Good, SAT word there for someone. um, and that, I'll describe that as like when you're cold, right? What happens? Well, your body shivers as a way of saying to you, like, hey, go put on a sweatshirt. Or the reverse, if your body's really hot, it will sweat and it will also alert you, like, hey, take off that sweatshirt, right? And we get those cues from our body around hunger, around fullness, and we can begin to tune into those a little bit as a first step. Now, if someone comes to me and they're very dysregulated, right, if they have been dieting for a long time, if they're engaging with disordered eating or an eating disorder, then we may need to start with more structure to that because it takes time to rebuild those, one, to rebuild the cues, because if we're undernourished, we actually won't even be getting them. But if there are other things like just anxiety, depression, stress, boredom, there might be many, busyness, right? That will disconnect us from our ability to hear those cues. So it's also saying, like, in what ways can you slow down throughout the day? Can we take a pause a couple of times of the day? Can we set a timer that says, okay, ideally, right, human metabolism, ideally we're eating every 3 to 4 hours. That's about the amount of time it takes our body to absorb, digest, and metabolize food so that we have energy to do all the things that we want to do. So if we're working on some of that structure, it's like, okay, what time do you wake up? Okay, within 90 minutes, let's set a timer so that we check in with our body and we feed our body, even if we're not feeling that hunger. But the process of slowing down, of asking our body, what do you want? What do you need? What would nourish you physically, mentally, emotionally? And then try to listen for the response and then try to answer. And then 3 hours later, set another timer, check in with your body again. And it's in that process of stopping, of trying to rebuild that connection through conversation with your body and nourishing it, even if it's just a little bit at the beginning. At each of those times, we're rebuilding that trust, because the trust that we have with our body, unfortunately, can be ruptured the same way trust with any external relationship can, have declined for many reasons. And it doesn't just come back overnight because we want it to. It takes consistency, it takes effort, but it can happen. And it's really beautiful when people will come back and be like, oh my gosh, I can hear my hunger again. Now, that also can become loaded because sometimes people don't want to be hearing their hunger because they're in this dialect of being like, I want the peaceful relationship with food, but I don't want my body to change, right? And so then there's even more work around those things, and about really learning to tolerate the body that we're in, and then thinking about it from a, how do we show up with kindness towards our body?
So many nuggets of wisdom in that response there. I loved all of that. First and foremost, the disconnection that we feel to our bodies is real. I mean, we are in a society where it's so easy to be in our mind all the time. It's so easy to be looking to the things outside of ourselves. And so that invitation for us to come back into our body, to tune into what our body wants and needs. I mean, how many people can actually answer that question? What does my body need right now? Or what does my body want right now? So I love the way that you explain the process too, because that's a really hard question. I can imagine that when you ask your clients that question right off the bat, they're like, what does that mean? I don't know. Stressed? Heavy? And so the way that you describe the process that you take them through, the intentionality of it all, and really you what I'm hearing is that you're turning it into a mental process, because it's easy for us to be in our mind, to use our mind. Okay, so let's use that as a superpower in this moment right now to inch our way back to our body, to inch our way back to reconnecting to our body.
Yeah. And over time, I really invite people to think about, what are the thoughts? What are the feelings, right? The kind of emotions, and what are the sensations in our body? Because we're going to be getting different information. And unfortunately, sometimes the thoughts are not really meant for us, right? I will sort of say, like, if you were standing on a train platform and a train that is not going to your destination comes by, you don't get on it, right? So wait for it, right? So if we have those thoughts that don't serve us, generally coming from that inner critical voice, right? We can practice not attaching to them. We can, that's as you both know, like that's a really beautiful mindfulness practice to say, like, I hear you, I release you. It's not always possible, right? It's a lot of work to be able to utilize that skill. And so oftentimes then I'll invite my clients to say, okay, well, where does that thought, perhaps it's like, the I'm too much, or I'm not enough, I'm not thin enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not smart enough, right? Whatever it is. And then that can turn into a feeling. And so then the idea is like, okay, what are you feeling? Can you distinguish? Is this loneliness? Is this sadness? Is this anger, right? Really trying to get clear, with the hope that we can eventually utilize distress tolerance, right? We can allow every feeling we've ever had, we can allow it to sort of have that crescendo, and eventually it will relent. But again, that is sometimes hard. So then I invite my clients to say, okay, what is that feeling like in your body? Like, where are you sensing that? Are your shoulders tight? Is your heart beating? Is your stomach turning over, right? Whatever it is. And then what might ease that, right? And so I've even had clients create like note cards where on one side it will say anger, and on the other side it's like, where is that in your body, and what are 3 things that you could do to try to release that, right? Because what we know is that if we are not able to find those off ramps, whether that's mindfulness, whether that's distress tolerance, whether that's one of those coping skills, we are likely going to engage in a behavior that is not ultimately going to serve us. And then when we engage in a behavior, say if it's someone that is struggling with restriction, then it goes right back into the thought of like, oh, I'm not good enough, I can't even, do this, I can't even not do this well. So we keep ourselves stuck in that loop. So really sort of thinking about all these different ways of connecting with ourselves, as a way of, one, healing, but two, like really stepping into our own well-being.
I'm always so grateful for the experience I had working at like a partial hospitalization or a PHP. It was basically a day program. I worked with women struggling with eating disorders, and I'm grateful for that experience because I personally learned so much. And like you said, I remember sitting in groups and I was like, what is my connection to my body? Like, I'm here as a therapist, and am I slowed down enough? Am I tuned in to my own body and my own relationship with my body? So not only did I grow personally, I grew so much tremendously as a therapist too. And just being able to sit with that emotion. Where is this anger? Where is this stress? And how is this anger or stress manifesting in my body? And how do I sit with and tune into that? And then I know what to do, right? Our bodies are so intuitive and so smart that as a clinical mental health therapist, I don't think I really truly valued, respected, I'm not sure the right word, my body enough. I was like, oh, the brain, like it's mental health, but it's like whole health. Like that's where like the holistic piece for me is so fascinating, so valuable, and like so critical to like our healing journey.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when I was working in higher levels of care, also, I was so grateful to be able to, co-facilitate groups with therapists, because there's so
Mm-hmm.
much learning and sharing
Mm-hmm.
that we got to do together. And, but for me, like the work that I've done to become a yoga teacher has also so influenced
Mm.
the work that I do with my clients, right? Because it is through the body, because as we've said, like sometimes the mind can trick us, and sometimes those feelings can be overwhelming, but the physical sensation of being in our body, if we can get out of our own way, that innate wisdom, and let that shine through, can often be that really first hard step for people.
Something that I continue to find really fascinating, and you both just kind of reiterated that, is that our mind lies to us all the time, right? Those intrusive thoughts that we have, the thoughts that we're not good enough or that we're not where we're supposed to be, our mind lies to us, but our body only knows the truth. It only speaks the truth to us. So, Heather and Elyssa, is that something that you both share with your clients? Is that reminder that our mind does trick us? It does lie to us sometimes, but coming back to the body is so important because it is the truth teller.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are many sort of tools that we'll use in the process of healing one's relationship with food in their body. And sometimes I will ask people to write down, like, what are all of those kind of food rules or body based rules that, whether we're calling it the eating disorder or the disordered thoughts, right? What are all those telling you? Because I think sometimes we don't even recognize how frequently those thoughts are coming up and probably dictating a lot of our behaviors without our consent, right? Without our knowledge. And so then the work is to come up with, I will often joke and be like, okay, we're going to pretend this is like a debate and we're going to come up with the rebuttal. Like, what does your wise minded self say in response to these critical, not true thoughts? And that can be a really beneficial way to begin to use the beauty that we know of neuroplasticity. We can create those new pathways. It takes effort, it takes time, but we can do it. And that can just be one of the ways that we're able to begin to change, right? Some of those intrusive thoughts, those critical voices that are not telling us the truth.
It's funny that we're having this conversation right now because a couple months ago, I think I posted a reel and I said, what if I told you that your brain is your biggest bully? And I really do feel like our brain is lying to us and tricking us, and it's not helpful. We can't believe everything that we think. I'm always pulling out all different like Venn diagrams of our emotional mind and our logical mind, and then what's the neutral thought in between? How can we blend the two together? And are you basing this thought on fact or feeling? I have all these different like ways to help us try to reframe these thoughts, but I think it starts with recognizing that it might, first you have to hear the thought and then recognizing, like, is this real or not? Is this true or not?
Yeah.
Can you hear the dog's water bottle in the background? Should I say that again? She's like drinking from this hamster wheel. Tortellini, enough.
We're going
Should
to
I say that
embrace.
part again?
Nope. We're going to embrace the imperfection
Yeah.
because what you said was
Okay.
great.
I mean,
God.
right. The fact that we're talking about like a peaceful relationship with food and your dog's name is Tortellini is like the greatest thing ever.
Oh my God. I'm going to mute myself. Keep going.
Our brain is our biggest bully and can also be our greatest friend. And as you spoke about the neuroplasticity of our minds and being able to really create a lot of change, it can also be a very powerful healer for us. But yes, we have to recognize that it can be our greatest bully. And coming back to your discovery, Elyssa, of yoga and using that as a tool to get back into the body, I love that. If you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, as I said, it was the first time I had felt like, wow, my body really is this. I can be in concert with my body and I can feel strength and I can feel there's, the studios that I practice in, there are no mirrors. And it really invites you to be in your body, be in touch with what's happening, to know like, is this feeling right? And when I teach also from a very trauma informed space to say, I am just here to give you some suggestions of funny ways to like move yourself around, but you're the person who knows your body best. And whether that is because of injury or for some other reason, like you have to make those adjustments that feel best in your own body. There is no right way to do a pose, there is your best way to do a pose. And just giving people that permission to explore and experiment and to feel what different things feel like in their body. Again, as we said, we're walking around so disconnected all the time. And so with some clients, I actually do get to do some movement, but it's more of doing some breath work with people when they're open to it. Again, of inviting people just to get quiet and to think about what is going on in my body, right? And then certainly there are poses that can be so beneficial in terms of down regulating our nervous system. And so when people are open to it, I'm always happy to pop down on the floor and do some poses even in my office with them if they're comfortable. But if not, it's like at least talking through, right? What are a few ways that you could try to explore being in your body each day? And this is going to sound a little bit silly, but I will even say, like, because we're all so busy, right? We could have a whole nother episode about sort of hustle culture and how that, sort of impacts diet culture. And in our busyness, in our day to day, we're not taking the time to check in with ourselves. And so I'll joke and I'll be like, well, every time that you're going to get up from, your desk or wherever it is that you're spending the majority of your time and go to the bathroom, like, give yourself a minute there, right? Go to the bathroom, do what you need to do, wash your hands, and then spend a minute, right? Feet on the floor, breathe, connect in with your body. Because hopefully you're doing that if you're, hydrated enough. Another dietitian question that we have. You're going to be doing that a number of times a day. It's like an actual time when you can stop. And so just those kind of simple opportunities, and people will unfortunately say that they spend so much of their time on autopilot, right? They're just not even sure, right? Like where the whole day went. And so being deliberate with how we're spending our time, I think is really important.
I do the exact same thing with some of my clients in incorporating these small little shifts into existing parts of their day. Like when you are brushing your teeth, pay attention or try to practice gratitude from the day before, because I think that's such an accessible way for us to actually start to integrate some of these practices, because these are things we're already doing. Morning cup of coffee, filling our water bottle, drinking that water bottle. Like we have to set ourselves up for success. So I think that's a really great way for us to start practicing this new skill that then becomes a part of our regular routine and our life.
Yeah. And because I think I've had so many clients who come in and are like, I want to learn to meditate, right? Or, we've talked about meditation maybe as a potentially beneficial tool. And then they're not able to, for whatever reason, create the time to do it. And then they feel bad about it, which is never the intention, right? And so it's saying, like, how do we, sort of change something that you're already doing that's already a non-negotiable in your life? If we can connect to that. And I liked what you said about, like, while you're already doing something else, right? When I've described what mindfulness is to people, it's like paying attention in the present moment and using your senses. And so I will always talk about when you're washing the dishes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can, right, see the bubbles, you can smell the dishwashing detergent, right? You can feel the warm water, right? There's so many opportunities to just connect in and to slow down right then and there. And then you're doing it. And it doesn't take a tremendous additional effort to be, making these small yet really potentially meaningful, changes.
And that's bringing me right back to our episode on presence, because we spoke about presence and how to be more present or be more aware in the present moment within our mind, which Heather, you offered those tools of while you're doing the dishes, while you're driving your car to work. We offered the suggestion of mindfulness in the body being awareness of your physical body, of the steps that you're taking while outside, the pace at which you're walking, the muscles that you're using while doing different movements. And then that spiritual awareness, too, is something that is already in existence. It's your awareness of your connection to life happening around you. So, what I really love is that you are offering in this episode, you're offering such tangible tips to just build on things that we're already naturally doing. There isn't necessarily additional things that we need to add on. It's just simply bringing that awareness to what's already going on in your life, which is very empowering, I feel.
And I think, Devin, you had said, like, when I ask my clients, like, what would nourish me? What do I want? What do I need? And you're absolutely right. People cannot do that at the beginning. And that's right. And I say that fully. Like, this is probably going to, first of all, sound a little strange to be asking yourself these questions. And then it's not going to come easily at the beginning, especially because we've been told, right, in so many different places, like eat this, don't eat that, right? There's always a new enemy in the diet culture. And so this idea of tuning into like, what do I actually really like to eat, right? What does feel good in my body? Because, there are going to be times when different foods don't feel great in people's bodies, but we need to be in that really grounded and connected and authentic place before we can honestly assess, right, how do different foods feel in our body. Because if not, we can unfortunately just turn that into another way to restrict. So we want to be very thoughtful and slow. I mean, I think that's one of the hard things about this process of reconnecting with our body and reconnecting with food in a peaceful way is it takes time.
I often say pay attention on purpose. And I think we have to really just try to slow down and really try. That's the big takeaway for me from this episode is slow down and try to pay attention and, let our bodies do what they're doing. We just have to tune in and listen. So I love so much of what you're sharing. And I'm so appreciative, Elyssa, that you are here with us and that you took the time to jump on this episode with us. Do you have any final thoughts, tips, words of wisdom? I mean, you've already shared so much, but just in closing, is there anything else that you'd want to add?
I mean, I think it's just going back to this idea, that our bodies are to be lived in, not looked at, right?
Mm.
And that can be something that we can begin to say to ourselves and catch ourselves when that's not the case, right? We live in a world that is full of external validation. And that's not entirely a bad thing, right? I'm not going to ever say that. But, I have a son who's 18, and I will recall at the earliest of like 6 months, people comparing like who's crawling first, who's pulling up first, right? And it never stops. And right then it's who's eating what first, and who's the making the A team for soccer, and who's the first chair for the trumpet. And then, certainly the college process of like how many APs and what college are they going to? It's constant. And while some of those things can be really wonderful and fun, and if we're playing soccer because it brings us joy, amazing, right? But because we're being judged and critiqued and compared moment after moment of our lives, it's hard to remember like that honestly none of that is who we truly are, right? But it's who we are, it's the characteristics that are unchanging inside of us that is truly where our worth comes from. And if we can try to get back in touch with that, I think that's going to help lead us in a much better direction, one that is truly fulfilling.
The more that we work towards a world where we are validating ourselves based off of how we're feeling and not in comparison to anybody else, not based on standards that others are placing for us. My goodness, what a world that will evolve into. So, thank you. That was super valuable. I loved all of this wisdom that you just shared with our audience. Thank you so much, Elyssa, for coming in, for sharing all of this with us. How can people find you? How can people work with you?
Sure. Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure. And when I, saw that you all were starting this podcast and knowing Heather and the amazing work that she's doing, and I was like, yeah, this is like totally, in line with the work that I do. So thank you for this opportunity. So I have a private practice where I see clients for individual nutrition counseling in Bergen County, New Jersey, in person, and then I can also see people virtually in a number of states. The dietitian licensure is interesting, but certainly New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut around us. And my practice name is Shining Light Nutrition, and so you can find me there. And my Instagram is Elyssa Toomey RDN. So I'm always happy to chat about all things food and body related.
We'll be certainly sure to include all of that information for our listeners in the show notes section so that you can find Alyssa's website and contact info and all the good things if you are interested in connecting more with her or learning more about her. But I'm so, so appreciative and grateful that you spent this time with us, Elyssa. It's really been so wonderful.
Thank you.
Devin, I don't know whose turn it is for us at the end of each episode, Elyssa. I don't know. I think you've been listening.
Yeah.
We take a look at our vision boards in front of us. Devin, whose turn is it this week? Do you know?
Well, is there any chance that, Elyssa, you have a vision board somewhere?
I mean, I'm really like, I do this. I'm part of a Jewish women's group, a Rosh Kadesh group, and I do this all, like, we do this monthly, like, where we sort of like use some sort of art method to like describe what's really coming up for us. And that was just on Tuesday. So I can like just recall from there, if you want.
That would be great.
Okay,
What?
that works.
Yeah.
So when I'm thinking about, where I want to be putting some energy in the coming days and weeks, it's really interesting that this is coming up in light of your last episode, is on like really intentional relationships, right? So much of how we feel about ourselves is based on sort of the thoughts and feelings of the people around us. And so I'm really trying to be very thoughtful about who I'm surrounding myself with, and recognizing, how do those people make me feel in my body, right? Are those people that when I'm with them, I feel energetic and but also a sense of peace and calm, and really, like my best self, and that those people light me up. And so my work is to be spending more time with those people.
Wow.
That is such a beautiful
That's
way.
so wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you, Elyssa, for joining us. Thank you, Devin, always for being here and co-hosting with me. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I can speak for myself. I loved, having this conversation. So stay tuned for more.
Same. Thank you so much, Elyssa. Thank you, everyone. And also tune into the show notes. There will also be a little interactive poll. We're still kind of figuring out how to get that set up and how to use that, but would love to hear from any of you on what really stood out to you, because Elyssa had so much to offer us today. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. We're looking forward to being back next week for another episode. Bye.
Bye. We are so glad that you took the time to share this space with us. We'll be releasing new episodes of Mind Meets Body and Soul every Tuesday, so be sure to give us a follow and share this podcast with those you love.
To connect with us and join our communities, head to the show notes where you'll find our contact information and individual websites. Until next week, stay grounded, keep growing, and trust that everything you seek is unfolding for you.